Chapter 38. The Crack. Smoke and dust hung in the air, the ground littered with the black rubble produced by the explosion. I leaned out and shone my flashlight into the blasted crevice, completely sealed off, preventing any outside black snakes from entering and complicating our exit through the original path. Among us, Fatty was in relatively good shape, suffering only from a few cuts on his hands due to the flying debris. Professor Chen remained unconscious, and Yi Sin had been knocked out by the blast wave. Her breath halted from the shock. I checked Yi Sin's breathing and found none, which was bad news. She was frail to begin with, and the impact of the explosion could have caused her to hold her breath. She needed immediate resuscitation. Temporarily deafened by the explosion, Shirley Yang, Fatty, and I were unable to communicate verbally. I gestured to Shirley Yang to administer artificial respiration to Yi Sin. Suddenly noticing blood flowing from Shirley's nose, I hurried to signal her to address the bleed. Shirley Yang quickly tore a piece of cloth to stanch the bleeding in her nose and scribbled something on her palm with her blood. She pointed at Yi Sin, and when I illuminated her palm with the flashlight, I saw the letters CPR. I didn't understand. Was she indicating that Yi Sin was beyond help? I shook my head in confusion. Realizing my bafflement, Shirley Yang set aside her bleeding nose, bent down, and began to press firmly down on Yi Sin's chest. That's when I grasped she meant for me to perform CPR. Just as I was about to take over, Yi Sin let out a soft moan. Her breath returned, and she began to cough. I quickly told Fatty to give her some water from his canteen. Relieved to see Yi Sin's recovery, Shirley Yang lifted her head, pressed against her own ears to stop the bleeding from her nose effectively. Just as the situation began to settle, and before I could fret over our current state, another crisis loomed. The so-called Ghost Cave lay within the belly of Zaglama Mountain, and this black mountain was like an empty shell, our location likely within some part of this outer casing. Due to the vast hollows within the mountain, formed over thousands of years and creating huge internal tensions, the mountain had developed many cracks. The recent explosion of the yellow explosives had impacted the mountain, pressing against already existing minor cracks, amplifying the pressure and creating a domino effect. Though temporarily deaf, I could feel the mountain quaking, the cracks in the ceiling above us widening as rubble began to fall, the situation worsening by the minute. While dodging the small stones raining down on us, I beckoned the others to leave quickly. As the cracks in the mountain's body widened and more rocks fell, we had no choice but to crawl upwards along the fissures. With each stretch we climbed, the path behind us was sealed by fallen debris, threatening to bury us alive if we dared to pause. Gritting our teeth and pulling each other along in a desperate bid for safety, we continued to climb towards safety. We moved awkwardly, not knowing how far we had managed to escape or for how long. Our hands were bloody and raw from sharp rocks, our breathing ragged. Each heartbeat felt like it could leap from our throats. Thirst and exhaustion overwhelmed us, compounded by the added burden of carrying Professor Chen, who was still unconscious, and Yi Sin, who could barely muster her strength. Eventually, drained of all energy and unable to move any further, we stopped, resigned to our fate, prepared to be buried alive. Unexpectedly, the spread of the cracks halted. The area a mere meter behind us filled up, leaving us lying on the ground, gasping for air, reluctant to drink the precious little water we had left. After a pause, Fatty broke the silence. "Old who? Are we dead or what?" Looking around at the pitch-black walls, I responded grimly, "Pretty much the same if you ask me. Even if we're alive now, we might not be for much longer." Fatty, who was completely exhausted and not quite lucid, turned to Shirley Yang and said jokingly, "Miss Yang, I bid you farewell in advance. In a while, Old Hu and I will be checking in with the King of Hell, and you'll be off to meet your god. Take care on your long journey." Shirley Yang retorted, clearly not in the mood for humor. "For God's sake, at a time like this, can you two stop talking nonsense? Ugh. Wait, I can hear again." I moved my jaw around. My ears were still ringing, but at least I could hear something. We checked our water bottles and supplies. My own bottle was lost in the chaos. Yi Sin had none since she was unconscious as we entered the city, and all we had left were barely 2 bottles among us. I explained the harsh truth, As hard as it might be to accept, we're trapped inside Zaglama Mountain with no way out. If the air circulation isn't enough, which I suspect it isn't, we won't last half an hour before we suffocate. We've also lost the remaining explosives, so we can't blast our way out. With some of us dead and others injured, and with only old Anlaman on the outside, who's a slippery character and probably took off at the first sign of trouble, we can't expect any rescue from the outside. Resigned to our situation, Fatty suggested. No point overthinking it. Throats as dry as kindling. We've got just 2 bottles left to drink. Let's just drink and then see. I divided the water in 2, giving one half to Yi Isin and Professor Chen, and sharing the other half among the 3 of us. Shirley Young barely managed 2 sips before she stopped, weighed down by guilt. If we really are going to die here, I can't help but think it's my fault. If it weren't for my obsession with finding Jingjue City, none of this would have happened, and all these people wouldn't have been dragged into it. I interrupted her self-reproach. You can't say that. There's an old saying in China, humans will risk death for wealth, as birds will for food. Fatty and I are here because of our own greed. If it weren't for the allure of your $40,000, we wouldn't have ended up in such a predicament. Besides, exploring ancient ruins is exactly what Professor Chen and his colleagues do for a living. Even without your funding, they'd still be out here looking for the relics of Jingjue. As I spoke, a thought struck me. I recalled Shirley Young once mentioning a recurring dream about the very cave we were trapped in, including vivid details like the iron chains on the queen's sarcophagus. She had even dreamt of something massive on top of the coffin, which was likely the corpse flower. She had thought these dreams were messages from her missing adventurer father, but now, considering everything, the notion seemed bizarre. Could Shirley possess some sort of prophetic ability? Upon inquiring, Shirley Young shook her head. I used to hear a voice calling me to this ghost cave in Zaglama Mountain. Only after seeing the abyss with my own eyes did I realize the expedition team my father belonged to had never reached the cave. They probably died somewhere in the desert. But why would I dream of a place I've never been? Fatty then half-jokingly suggested, maybe in your past life you were the queen of Jingjue, revisiting your old haunt. Before he could finish, the sound of more cracking echoed through the mountain. The aftermath of the previous explosion was not yet over. Another cave-in seemed imminent. Though we were braced for death, we weren't willing to wait patiently for our end. Suddenly, a large crack appeared ahead, the flashlight beam revealing a silhouette sitting within. But before we could properly investigate, stones began to rain down like hail, leaving us no time to ponder. Hurrying for safety, Shirley led the way with her flashlight, Fatty carried Professor Chun, and I dragged Yi Sin as we all swiftly entered the newly formed crevice. Barely situated in this new location, we found it hard to breathe due to the claustrophobic space, abundant dust, and stale, stagnant air. Quickly, we donned our gas masks just as a thunderous rumble signaled numerous large black rocks falling and sealing the entrance behind us. I turned to assess our surroundings and realized we were in a small square stone room, roughly 10 square meters in area. At the center was an ancient, monolithic stone chest, unlike the black stone commonly found in Jingjue City. This chest was dusty and primitive in its simplicity, made from a unique type of stone we had never encountered before. The chest, standing over half a meter tall and more than a meter long, was finely crafted and decorated with several carved stone murals, its purpose unknown. Wrapped up in examining this peculiar artifact, we didn't immediately notice 2 figures seated cross-legged on either side of the chest. As we drew closer, the flashlight beam revealed their forms, leading to an involuntary startle and the flashlight crashing to the ground. Darkness enveloped us yet again, punctuated only by Fatty's alarmed shout, "Tu Zongzi!"